Look at all this.
This will be saved for people who can't make it tonight, but welcome everyone. Thanks for coming back. For those of you who were here last week, if you missed last week, we'll get you caught up in no time at all. So this is week 2 of the Bible Then and Now, and we're looking at what the death of Jesus tells us about him and us. I was describing this earlier today to somebody that previous series, we've really had just a couple of texts, things we can fit on a single slide and we can talk about those texts. And this is a really different series because we're looking at the stories of Jesus' passion, which tend to be about 2 chapters long as the Gospels tell it. And it's a lot of material and a lot to fit on there. So in a lot of ways, we're flying at about 30,000 feet over these and looking for some details that we can use to kind of get our bearings. So if it goes too fast in some ways, apologies for that. Last week, I pretty much spoke all the way into the small group discussion time just to try to get us squared away. But I'm going to start us actually with a short video clip, if I can pull this off correctly. So let me do this. I'm going to mute everybody just to get the sound okay. To introduce this, let me just say this. One of the questions about the Passion narratives, really in all 4 Gospels, revolves around the question of responsibility. Who's responsible for the death of Jesus? Which isn't a question that the Gospels seem really interested in putting at the forefront, but it's been an important thing because so much of the church's history has had an anti-Semitic or an anti-Judaic angle toward it. And for many generations in the Middle Ages, the most dangerous day on the calendar to be Jewish in Western Europe or Eastern Europe was Good Friday, because Christians would come out of their Good Friday services and have been whipped into a frenzy of kind of anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic fervor and would go and attack people or would burn down synagogues. And that's probably more the fault of their leaders than it is the fault of the biblical texts. But the biblical texts do indeed have some role in all of that, because the way they highlight the role of the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem, the way they highlight the role of the crowd as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight because Matthew's gospel raises some questions about that. So I mentioned last week that each week I want to talk about something historical to get us started. Last week it was the sheer fact of crucifixion itself. This week it's the question of how the Gospels portray the general public, or how they portray crowds. And so when they give us these stories of hearings or of trials before the Jewish leadership and before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, one question that came up last week was, how do we know what they were talking about? How do we know that the authors got good information or not? That's one question. The other question is, why does the role of the Jewish priesthood seem to be so important, but also why does the role of the crowd? And the crowd is probably a Jewish crowd because, again, this is Jerusalem. This is happening during Passover. And so how does the crowd speak a voice? So to take us into that, I want to show a clip from a film, which is a film from 1964 called The Gospel According to St. Matthew. It's by an Italian director named Pasolini. And it's an Italian film, so there's subtitles. I'm just going to show about 2 minutes of it. It's often described as one of the best Jesus movies that are out there. Now, the bar is pretty low for a good Jesus movie, I have to admit. But this one of the things that's been noted by critics about this film is that it does a particularly good job of reframing some of these scenes that raise the question of who's responsible, who's most powerful, who turns on Jesus, and does it in a particularly, what I think, interesting way. So I'm going to show it to you now, and hopefully this will come through well. If for any reason you can't see or hear, or this fails miserably, just unmute yourself and let me know. But this, it picks up, we'll start off with the Apostle Peter, who follows the crowd in and witnesses Jesus being interrogated by the Jewish leadership, the Jewish temple leadership.
Testimoniare contro costui.
Costui ha detto: io posso distruggere il Tempio di Dio e in 3 giorni riedificarlo.
Anche io ho sentito dire queste cose.
Pure io. Nulla rispondi a quanto costoro depongono contro di te. Ti scongiuro, per il Dio vivente, di dirci se tu sei il Cristo, il figlio di Dio.
Tu l'hai detto. Anzi, vi dirò che d'ora in avanti vedrete il figlio dell'uomo seduto alla destra della potenza di Dio, venire sulle nubi del cielo.
Ha bestemmiato! Ha bestemmiato! Ha bestemmiato! Ha bestemmiato! Che bisogno abbiamo ancora di testimoni? Ha bestemmiato! Voi tutti avete udito la bestemmia. A voi la sentenza.
Reo di morte. Reo di morte.
Reo di morte. E reo di morte. E reo di morte.
So I'm stopping it there. The what you probably almost certainly noticed was the the obstructions that the filmmaker puts you in the perspective of the crowd, and you're obstructed. You can't really see all that's going on. That instead of pulling the camera in really tight and making this a story about the leadership and perhaps their power over Jesus, the filmmaker makes us watch from the perspective of somebody in the crowd, which gives us some distance from it, which gives us perhaps a greater sense of confusion in all of it. Maybe it de-emphasizes the role of the leadership. Maybe it emphasizes it even more, where you feel like this is something happening to Jesus by certain people who wield power over him, and not by the crowd in general. If we had more time, we'd look at the scene where he's before Pilate, and it's done in a similar way, where the camera is located amongst the crowd, which is perhaps a way of telling the people watching the film also that we're not necessarily watching a story about people once upon a time who did something to Jesus. We're actually watching a story that in a way continues to indict us or continues to pull us into the story. Various ways you might interpret that, but it's very different from how the Gospels tell the story, which is basically, and again, the Gospels aren't films, they're literature, but they put us really in the midst of the action, while this film takes us a little bit at a distance. So I just find that interesting, and maybe a way to start the conversation tonight, or to start the investigation tonight, by asking the question of, well, what do the Gospel authors allow us to see, right? What are we given access to in the story? And so I want to take us then into Matthew's Gospel and see how that works in this story. So again, last week we did Mark, this week Matthew, next week we'll do Luke. And I mentioned as well previously that Matthew tells the story of Jesus' arrest, his trial, his parade to the cross, and his crucifixion very similarly to Mark. Luke and John have a lot more differences, but there are some things about Matthew that are different. But first, the similarities, and I'll go through these relatively quickly, but the order of events in Matthew and Mark is the same, where Jesus is arrested and all of his followers desert him in the Garden of Gethsemane, just outside the walls of Jerusalem. There's a trial held at night before the Jewish high priest, who is the one who runs the temple essentially, and also collaborates with the Roman government to keep order. In the trial, both Mark and Matthew describe the trial as rigged. In other words, false witnesses are brought in for the express purpose of securing a conviction. Peter denies Jesus 3 times in both of these Gospels. In the morning then, Jesus is brought before Pilate relatively early in the morning, and Pilate then will issue a sentence against Jesus. In the midst of that, there's negotiations concerning this other prisoner who we don't know anything about except how he's described in these scenes. In other words, he's not a character anywhere else in the gospel. He only shows up in the Passion narrative. This man named Barabbas, whose name, ironically enough, means son of the Father. So the son of the Father goes free, while Jesus, the Son of God, as the Gospels describe him, goes to the cross. Pilate then hands Jesus over to Roman soldiers to be crucified. Along the way, Jesus is mocked, and the soldiers force him to undergo a kind of mock coronation. They dress him in a purple robe. They kneel down before him. They put a crown on his head, things like that. A man named Simon from Cyrene, which is in what's now today Libya, in northern Libya, is conscripted to carry the cross to Golgotha. Jesus either can't or won't carry it. And Simon appears to be the wrong guy in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he's forced to carry the cross. Jesus is then crucified as a royal pretender. Both Mark and Matthew describe him being executed as the King of the Jews. And everybody who's present in the crucifixion scene derides him or mocks him or criticizes him. As we saw last week as well, Jesus dies quoting Psalm 22, verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And screams with a loud cry. We're told the temple curtain is torn in half. We're told that the centurion, the Roman official who's there at the cross, refers to Jesus as God's son. We're told that a group of women disciples were watching from a distance, but we're not told that until after Jesus dies. And then we're introduced to Joseph of Arimathea, who is the one who ensures that Jesus is buried in a tomb, an above ground tomb. So these are the similarities between Matthew and Mark. Bible scholars always like particularity and differences. So I want to point out ways in which then Matthew looks different from Luke's gospel. And I want to highlight 6 things kind of in a hurry here, and then I'll walk us through them in a little bit more detail in just a moment. What are the 6 additional events that Matthew describes? Maybe this isn't additional, but when Jesus is in dialogue with the high priest during his interrogation, the things that he says are slightly different than they are in Mark's gospel. Matthew's gospel is the only of the 4 that tells of Judas coming back to the chief priests and trying to repent. You might remember they give him money to hand Jesus over. In Matthew chapter 27, Judas says, I've sinned by betraying innocent blood. And the priests say, yeah, we don't care. What's that to us? And Judas throws the money down, and then we're told he goes out and hangs himself in Matthew's gospel. Matthew's gospel is the only of the 4 in which Pilate's wife, we don't know her name, but she sends a report to Pilate saying, have nothing to do with this man because I've suffered in a dream because of him. This is also the only of the 4 gospels where Pilate dramatically washes his hands in full view of the crowd. This is the only gospel where the crowd offers to take Jesus' blood upon themselves. I'll unpack that more in a few minutes. And this is also the only gospel that describes an earthquake taking place when Jesus dies, and also describes people rising from the dead on Good Friday itself. So number 1 is a subtle change between Mark and Matthew. Numbers 2 through 6 are all things that only show up in Matthew's gospel. That's all by way of a really rapid introduction Maybe I should pause here and just make sure I haven't lost anybody, or does anybody want to weigh in with a question or a comment? Do you see where I'm going? Have I said anything outlandish or, or confusing at 15 minutes in? Or are we good to go? I see nobody shaking their head or waving at me or looking disgusted. So I will keep going then. I want to unpack those 6 things, those details that Matthew includes. Why does Matthew include them? I'm not sure we can answer that question, but the fact that Matthew does include them suggests that Matthew is trying to tell the story in a way that wants to direct our attention to some particular details, that wants to make sure we see these aspects of what the death of Jesus means from that particular perspective. So I'll go back to my slides. It's an easy way to put text in front of everybody. And I'll walk through these 6 things then, and we can talk about them. The first thing is that there are subtle differences in Jesus' dialogue with the high priest. Remember, Jesus is arrested at night after the Passover meal. He is brought into the high priest's residence somewhere. The high priest is essentially the highest ranking Jew in the region. He has control over the temple. There are chief priests who are his underlings. And he also is in close contact with the Roman officials. We're told in some other sources outside of the New Testament that the Roman governor and his officials would hold on to the high priestly vestments, the clothing that the high priest would have to wear on special holy days. It was Rome's way of reminding everybody that the Romans really ran everything. But they were willing to let the high priest and the chief priests have local control because they were the local elites. They ran the religious life. They ran a lot of the social life. And so the chief priests were able to kind of keep their influence on the condition that things never got out of hand, right? The taxes were still paid. There was no civil unrest and things like that. So when the high priest interrogates Jesus at night, and again, we're told that false witnesses have been brought in, this is what happens. Matthew tells us that nobody's able to agree. And then at last, 2 false witnesses came forward and said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." A slight difference here. In Mark's gospel, the false witnesses say that Jesus said, "I'm going to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days." This is a little bit different. He just said, "I'm able to do it," which would be remarkable. We're talking about a huge structure here. The high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. So we see this in a lot of the passion narratives. He seems to be unwilling or uninterested in trying to argue for his life or argue for his innocence. Then the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God." This is only in Matthew's gospel, which is interesting. Here we have the high priest using his religious authority, essentially saying, as the one who's, again, the highest ranking religious official, also in some ways the highest ranking political official from a Jewish point of view, right? I put you under oath, basically. You are now speaking to me as if you are speaking before God. I put you under oath. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, "You have said so." This is one of those places where we really wish we had stage directions or, notes to the reader in the Gospels. What Jesus says here could be translated as a question. Are you saying that? Is that what you're saying? Or here, the New Revised Standard Version puts it as a declarative sentence, right? You have said so. That's possible. It's possible Jesus is saying, "That's right, you said it." It's possible that Jesus is saying, "Hey, those are your words, they're not mine." It's a slightly evasive answer, at least it's an ambiguous answer. But just to note here, again, some of these subtle differences, most particularly the high priest drawing on his own authority as if he's the one who is able to hold Jesus to an oath or to hold Jesus to a vow. If that's the case, and if Jesus is indeed the Messiah, the Son of God, there's something a little bit ridiculous about the high priest trying to get him to, be loyal to an oath when Jesus is essentially the oath keeper, I guess, or the one who is to whom the oath maker would be accountable. So there are those differences. The second thing is the story of Judas. Judas shows up in all four Gospels. He's the one who betrays Jesus, is the language usually used. He's the one who identifies Jesus to the arresting officials on a dark hillside in the middle of the night. Mark and Matthew don't tell us what his motive was. They're never explicit about what causes Jesus to do this. Both Luke and John, we will say that Satan plays a role in motivating Judas. But for Matthew, we're not exactly sure why. But Matthew is also the only gospel where we see what happens to Judas afterwards. The book of Acts also talks about Judas, but here in Matthew, it's this: when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, right? Once Judas realized he knows how it's going to end, which might suggest that Judas thought that his turning Jesus over wouldn't end with him condemned. Maybe he thought Jesus would fight for himself. Maybe he thought Jesus would lead a revolution. It's not entirely clear. But we're told that Judas repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What's that to us? See to it yourself." Throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed and went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, "It's not lawful to put them into the treasury since they are blood money," which of course they paid to Judas earlier. After conferring together, they used them, the pieces of silver, to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. A tragic end to Judas's story. It appears here at the end, he realizes he's done something wrong. He wants to make it right, perhaps, or wants to confess or find absolution. And so he goes to the religious authorities, the ones whose work, it appears, is repentance and forgiveness, and tries to do that, but they won't hear him, right? They kind of refuse their priestly role as mediators between Judas and God. So they fail him, just as if they perhaps are failing the people in the larger story of Jesus' trial and in his prosecution. We have to remember that the chief priests are, like I said, they're religious officials. They're also very much political officials. We're probably talking about a very narrow slice of people who lived in and around Jerusalem. We're probably talking about fewer than 100 people when we think about who the chief priests were. These are people who have got very impressive family lineages. They come from long lines of priests. They've had kind of local management responsibility of the temple for a long time. And that's where they get their income, essentially, is from their work around the temple. It doesn't mean they're corrupt, but it does mean that they're perhaps in a bit of a bind where they've got their commitment to the temple that they want to keep up. They believe that that's how God is encountered and known in everyday life. But they also are kind of co-leaders alongside the Roman government. They're the local leaders who have been charged, like I said, to keep the domestic peace. And so the priests, with what happens to Judas, perhaps we see a bit of a catch-22 for the priests. Maybe they recognize it's their job to be in the repentance and forgiveness business, but they also recognize that they believe that's for the greater good that Jesus needs to be handed over to Pilate. Perhaps they feel that forgiving Judas or allowing Judas the opportunity to repent would expose their own complicity in this. It's not exactly clear, but there's something about Judas's repentance that is both a sad ending for Judas, a tragic ending for Judas, but is also, I think, a way in which we see the treachery of the priests in even clearer light, at least from Matthew's perspective. Let me go to the third one, and then I'll take a quick break after this and check in. But Pilate's wife reports a dream, and this is very short, but this is when Jesus is before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. And we're told this, that when he was sitting on the judgment seat, when Pilate was on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." That's all we're told. It appears that Pilate's wife is trying to get Pilate to either let Jesus go free or somehow recuse himself from this. Somehow this dream has imparted some kind of truth or conviction to to Mrs. Pilate, whatever you want to call her, to Pilate's wife. That's significant because dreams show up in other places in Matthew's gospel. We aren't too far beyond Christmas, but you remember the Christmas story, at least as Matthew tells it in the first chapter and the second chapter of Matthew's gospel. Joseph wants to put Mary away privately, we're told, when he discovers that she's pregnant. And Joseph is told in a dream that he should trust and that he should take Mary as his wife and, be father to the child. Also, after Jesus has been born for a little bit and the wise men or the magi come to visit, God again communicates to Joseph in a dream and tells Joseph that he should take Mary and the infant and should flee to Egypt for a while while Herod goes on his rampage. So dreams have been used already in Matthew's gospel as a way for God to communicate to confused characters or to characters who find themselves in risk or who find themselves at these important junctions in the story. And so that appears to be happening as well to Pilate's wife. It appears that she's been in some way chosen for some kind of divine communication, and she passes this news along to Pilate. We don't get a response, like Pilate doesn't write a note back to her or anything like that, but Pilate keeps going with the trial, keeps going with the prosecution, suggesting that he dismisses what his wife has to say with her dream, which perhaps makes Pilate look even more culpable. I love this piece of art, but we'll come back to that in just a minute when we get to Pilate washing his hands. That's a lot. I've been talking a lot. We talked about the hearing before the chief priest. We talked about the now I just of course have forgotten it. Before the dream. This is terrible. It's been a long day, folks. What was the second point?
Judas.
Oh, poor Judas. Everybody forgets about Judas. Sorry. We talked about the trial. We talked about Judas, and we talked about the dream of Pilate's wife. All of ways of, I think, maybe ratcheting up or accentuating some of the tragedy in this, some of the ways in which the people who have the power to pull the lever to stop this or to fix this either can't see what's true or choose not to. While other people who want to influence it, like Judas or Pilate's wife, prove to be unable to get the right people to listen to them. Any questions on those details or thoughts or things that you see that I didn't get to that we should lift up for the common good? Yeah, I see Ken and then Tom waving at me. Yeah, Ken, do you want to start?
Go ahead, Ken.
Hi, Matt, can you talk a little bit about the prevalence or stigma associated with suicide in this time in history? I'm just curious because of the choice of Judas to hang himself, commit suicide. Was that common? Is there any other thought about that you have?
That's a good question. I need to look into this. I don't know as much about it as I should. I do believe that in Jewish thought it was what's the word to use? I mean, that it was looked down upon, right? Nobody saw this as a good option. In broader Roman culture, it was, in some cases, could be seen as an honorable way to die, right? If you were I mean, you perhaps you're nodding, right? Honor shame culture sometimes has a place for somebody who has disgraced themselves to have a kind of an honorable exit, so to speak. But in the Jewish literature, it's pretty deeply frowned upon. I don't think it's considered like an unforgivable sin or anything like that, which you sometimes hear in some Christian circles in very unhelpful ways. And I would urge you not to adopt that view. I just don't see it in Scripture. It's maybe this wasn't your question, Ken, but there are, like, in early Christian writings from like the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries that reflect on Judas, the opinion is kind of split. Some say that he was essentially a devil and he was a horrible person with no redeeming qualities whatsoever, and so good riddance for a guy like that. But there are also a lot of other Christians who write about him as if what he did was an attempt to try to connect with Jesus in some way through his suicide. And this gets a little bit outlandish. Like there's one sermon from, I think, the 5th century that says that Judas hanged himself so that his soul might get to heaven before Jesus so he could ask for forgiveness, which there's a lot of creative license obviously being taken there. But what you see going on there is Christian authors trying to ask the question, there has to be forgiveness even for Judas, right? Right? Nobody is ever that far gone that they're beyond the reach of forgiveness, are they? And so there are these creative moves of trying to kind of redeem him in some way, shape, or form by some early Christian authors. Matthew doesn't really give us much commentary, but I think Matthew, I think it's, well, to me, I use the word tragic. It seems a tragic ending that Judas finds himself having miscalculated or made a mistake or done something, and at least he recognizes it, but it's too late, right? It's like, this is the stuff that movies are made of, right? When somebody can't undo the act they did. And the tragedy for him is he's left abandoned, that he's abandoned Jesus, and now the authorities of his religious group have abandoned him, and he's alone. But I'll try to look up that, Ken, to see if I can get a little bit more clarity about how it was viewed. Tom, you had a question or a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to ask about Judas as well. What didn't the chief priest know where Jesus was? Meaning, why did they pay Judas money to have a group, have him arrested? Didn't they know where he was, or couldn't they have found him relatively easy?
Yeah, just
by asking Judas or one of the disciples or one of the other people in the crowd.
Yeah, good question. So Judas is, in all 4 Gospels, Judas is the quote unquote betrayer, right? He's the one who sells Jesus out. Historically, we don't know much at all else about him. In John's Gospel, John describes him as a thief, that he was the treasurer of the group and used to steal from the common purse. That's the only other real detail we get about him. He's part of the ministry. He's there at the Last Supper. So we don't know much about him. Some people have noted that the name Judas just means Jew, and have suggested that he's perhaps kind of a made-up character to heighten the sense that of kind of Jewish culpability in the death of Jesus. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but I understand why some people say that. I think historically, if indeed Jesus is going to be seized during Passover, then they probably do need somebody to help. The authorities probably do need somebody to help figure out where is he going to be. Because at Passover, the city of Jerusalem is somewhere between 2 to 4 times its usual population. So people are living in friends and neighbors' homes. Jesus is probably camping out on the Mount of Olives. It's probably filled with people camping. And so if they want to seize him at night and do it quickly and get him into a safe house where they can process him, they probably need somebody to know where he is. And then as well, Judas betraying Jesus with a kiss, that heightens the pathos of the moment, right? Heightens the tragedy that with an expression of love, Judas would give Jesus over. But it also makes sense why it would be a signal, right, to the soldiers. If you're one of 50 soldiers and you're rushing onto the Mount of Olives and you got to get this guy in a hurry, you've got your person who's going to kind of rat him out or signal him out. So that's the possibility, is that Judas makes it easier for them to seize Jesus in a big hurry.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It had to be, they wanted to do it that night, and
Right.
It was a rush.
Right, because previously in the chapters prior to this, they say things like that the leadership wants to arrest him, but they're afraid to do it during the festival because of the crowd, because they know Jesus is too popular. So, and then they change their mind, and they seem to change their mind because Judas says, "Hey, if you want, I can give him up to you." And perhaps that is what makes them think, "Ooh, we could do this a lot quicker and quieter," because they don't want to seize him in the temple in the middle of broad daylight, because they think they're going to lose the popular battle, right? Or the crowds will riot and rise up against them. So yeah, again, it kind of underscores the treachery of all of this and the secretiveness of it, but also the real political risk that the chief priests find themselves in, I think. Barbara, I saw your hand.
Well, in the passage, it says that Judas repents and he wants to give the money back. And so I didn't see where the repentance part came in. I was looking more of that he was remorseful. He kind of realizes what's going to happen now that he's identified Jesus. And it's more like, oh my gosh, I'm really remorseful. I'm sad what I've done. I'll give the money back and I'll make the high priest part of responsibility, but I didn't see a repentance part in there. Is there other commentary that talks about he repented versus being remorseful?
No, it's just that one line in Matthew, which does say that he repents, but it doesn't describe what that looks like, or doesn't kind of pull us into his feelings or things like that. And he says, "What, I've sinned by betraying innocent blood." So there is a kind of confession that's part of it, but
okay, thank you.
It's about all we get. Yeah. Anybody else on these three details? I think I'll keep going then. Oh, yeah, Jerome.
How much of the details of what we just talked about were in prophecy that had been prophesied?
You mean like where there's a kind of Old Testament parallel or something like that?
Right.
I think none, or at least Matthew never stops and says, "This was done to fulfill what the prophet said," or something like that. So nothing, I would say, explicit. When Jesus is being interrogated by the chief priests, he does talk about coming again. He quotes from the book of Daniel. That was, I didn't put that on the screen. It's part of the longer scene. He quotes from the book of Daniel to describe coming in glory or coming in power at a future time. So maybe that's the closest thing.
3 or 4 times he says this is said to fulfill the.
No.
I was going to ask him. I don't know how much of a biblical scholar he thinks Andrew Lloyd Webber is.
I think that's you, Ken. Did I get your question about the prophecy?
Yeah, I thought there was more to that.
At least nothing that's explicit here. Later on, like similar things around, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" as a quote from Psalm 22. I mean, some of the things that I talked about a bit last week are also there.
Okay.
All right, I think I'm going to move on. I'm just going to mute folks. I'm hearing a bit of an echo on my computer, but yeah, Judas is, I think Judas and Pilate are two of the most interesting characters in the whole New Testament, just because we never are given access to their motives. It's really hard to tell what's going on in their minds. Are we supposed to read them sympathetically? Are we supposed to see them as forces of evil here, or what's happening? Judas in particular has been sometimes acclaimed as a hero, as the only disciple who really understood what Jesus was about. And sometimes he's just, born to be a villain in every respect. Sometimes he's this zealot who doesn't quite understand, or he's disillusioned. I mean, it's always interesting in a Jesus movie to see how Judas gets portrayed, whether he's sympathetic or not. But I spend time watching Jesus movies. It's part of the job. So, all right, 3 more details from Matthew that I think are worth our attention. Pilate washing his hands only shows up in this gospel, where it says this: when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing. Well, what's going on here? It's Friday morning, not long after sunrise. The chief priests and the high priest have brought Jesus to Pilate, and Pilate has a crowd among him as well. And Pilate saying things like, what should I do with the one you call King of the Jews? And they're debating about Barabbas. And so it says, when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning. Riot might be too generous of a translation there. A kind of, unrest might be a better word. It doesn't necessarily mean it was a huge crowd, but people are starting to get a little upset. He took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. Often this is portrayed as Pilate saying, I don't want anything to do with this. You can do what you want, but, I really would love to let him go, but you won't let me. So I'm going to, recuse myself of everything here. Possibly it doesn't really fit with who Pilate was in the ancient world. We know a bit about Pilate from other sources. On the one hand, Pilate's the most powerful person in this entire Roman province. He's handpicked by the emperor to be there. He essentially has all the authority of the emperor. He's not really bound by much in terms of local law. He's pretty much allowed to do what he needs to do to keep the peace and to preserve Roman interests in the area. We know from other writings from the period that Pilate was known for stealing. He would steal from the temple treasury to fund social works projects. Like, he takes money out of the temple treasury to build an aqueduct. One day he decides it would be a good idea to have flags and banners in the temple with an image of the emperor on them. That doesn't go over so well in Jewish holy space when you've got a commandment against graven images in the 10 Commandments. Pilate had a history of provoking the local Jewish population, and in fact was finally removed from power, I think in the year 37, because the complaints against him by the local Jewish leadership were just so incessant that finally the emperor said, it's just not worth it. This guy just doesn't know how to win the hearts and the minds of the locals. In other words, it seems really odd that Pilate would want to excuse himself or recuse himself from this. I think it's also entirely possible that Pilate knows what he's doing here and is trying to not only get rid of Jesus, but in the process, convince the crowd, convince the chief priests that they are also kind of co-collaborators with him, with Pilate, in doing this, right? When Pilate turns to the crowd and he says, what should I do with the guy who calls himself the King of the Jews? Well, how are you going to answer that, right? If you say, well, let him go, right? Or forgive him, it's possible somebody's taking down your name as well. The hand washing ceremony is an interesting thing. The book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, chapter 21, describes a hand washing process that was used when there was an unsolved murder. So somebody finds a corpse in a town or a village, and they're not able to determine how this person was killed. The concern in Deuteronomy was that this would have potential to bring a curse to the entire village or to the entire town. And so the elders of the city would wash their hands as a way of trying to kind of purify the larger city. So what's going on here, Pilate in a way is trying to argue for his own innocence, trying to argue that he's simply fulfilling the will of the crowd. while at the same time, the ritual might perhaps also be a way that he acknowledges that what's happening here isn't a just penalty, but is perhaps even Jesus' own murder. In other words, it's not clear that Pilate's act is really sincere, or whether it's a little bit more cynical, perhaps. Matthew also starts to refer to him pretty regularly as the governor. Instead of by name, refers to him as the governor, a reminder of his power in the region, and the fact that he's the one who gets to decide if Jesus lives or dies. The local Jewish population wasn't allowed to carry out capital punishment on their own. Only the Roman governor in the area was able to do that. As Pilate is just about finished, there's a cry from the crowd that's only in Matthew's gospel, which is kind of, well, it is not kind of, it is a notorious line as Pilate is negotiating, or not, is talking with the crowd as he says, you know, I'm innocent of this man's blood, see to it yourself. The crowd yells back to Pilate, it says, as a whole, his blood be on us and on our children. In the context of Matthew, it's not entirely clear what's going on here. It seems that at a basic level, the crowd is saying, don't you worry about this, Pilate, we'll take responsibility. On a larger level, this has been, I mean, once we kind of move outside of the context of the story Matthew is telling, this verse has been interpreted in Christian history in some really notorious ways. It's been taken through a lot of the church's history as a kind of statement that the crowd speaks on behalf of Judaism and all Jews, saying basically, let the responsibility for Jesus be taken off of Rome and now put on the Jewish people. So again, not just in the Middle Ages, but that was in a lot of ways the heyday of a lot of Christian anti-Semitism. This verse was used as a kind of proof text or a kind of verification of the idea of Jewish blood guilt, the belief that all Jews are Christ killers, for example. It's a verse that has been cited in all sorts of ways that probably go beyond what Matthew might have meant by it, and have been the root of all sorts of bad behavior by the church. I'm going to talk about Jesus movies again, excuse me. But when Mel Gibson's movie came out, this was maybe 15 years ago or more. I don't know if you remember that or not, but there was a huge controversy because Gibson was like, I'm going to make a movie that's true to the Gospels, that shows it exactly like it happened. And a lot of Jewish groups said, you're not going to include Matthew 27:25, are you? And Gibson did. His concession was somebody in the crowd yells it off camera in Aramaic, but I think there's no subtitle or something like that. So, but it's there. But it's become a verse that's, like I said, it has a notorious reputation because of the way in which the church has read this, making the crowd into a kind of like representation of all Judaism, and making the death of Jesus now something that we can pin the blame on a particular people. Hopefully you can tell by the way I'm talking about this, I would urge you not to read Matthew this way. I think Matthew at times does indeed levy a lot of blame and a lot of criticism towards the Jewish leadership in all parts of Matthew's gospel. And we want to be really careful as Christians not to imagine that as a kind of Christian denunciation of Judaism in general, although the Gospels have been used for that. I mean, all Christian theology and scripture at unfortunate times in the church's history has been used in that way. And so I would urge us to see this somewhat very differently. It's a good reminder that we have to ask ourselves, well, who is this crowd that yells back to Pilate in Matthew's depiction? We're never really told exactly who they are or where they come from, but more importantly, we're never told how large they are. This is pure speculation, But I would imagine that if the Jewish leadership is concerned about an uprising, if they seize Jesus in the middle of the night by secret, if they try him in front of the high priest during the night, that they're probably not going to parade him in front of a crowd of hundreds or thousands of people. But that when Pilate meets with them, they might want to keep this a much smaller group. So I like a painting like this that shows, here's Christ before Pilate, with really only maybe a couple of dozen people who are present there. This might have been a much smaller group who's calling for Jesus as opposed to the entire city. There's a bit of a hint here about what's going on in Matthew 27, where it says, now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. That's interesting, right? The chief priests and the elders, the religious elites, are working the crowd while Jesus stands before Pilate. They're persuading people, right? You're not going to vote for Jesus, are you? You're going to vote for Barabbas, aren't you? And if you're, an ordinary person who's found his way before the Roman governor, that would be significant to have one of the chief priests actually talking to you. It might be that this is a hand-picked group. It could be that this is a group that the high priest and the chief priests have chosen to stand before Pilate to help pressure him or to help, bear witness to an outcome that the chief priests already want. In other words, I would view the scene much more like in this painting than, for example, like this painting. It would be a little nuts for Pilate to parade Jesus in front of, thousands of people in the streets of Jerusalem and ask them, what do you think I should do? I don't know. I've never been an autocrat, but I don't think I would rule that way if I were. But it's just to show the ways in which our image of this scene, our image of the trial of Jesus has been shaped so much by a lot of visual art. It's been shaped by a lot of film, and a lot of film at least likes over-the-top representations of what's going on here. Do I know exactly how many people were present when Pilate is with Jesus? No, because the Gospels don't help us paint the scene in that way. But it seems likely to me that it would be a much smaller group than we might expect. Let me move on to number 6, the last of the 6 things. This detail that is only in Matthew's gospel and is a little bit, unusual or bizarre. When Jesus dies, he's just called out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we're told at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. That's also there in Mark's gospel from last week. Now from this point on is only in Matthew. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. That's a polite way of saying bodies of the saints, people who were dead, were resurrected. And after Jesus' resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. A couple of details here. Well, tremendous earthquake that breaks open rocks and tombs is worth noting. People who were dead are raised, but they don't come out of their tombs until Easter, which is also kind of interesting here. Again, this is only in Matthew's gospel. Obviously there's some symbolic value to what's being said here. Something about the death of Jesus from Matthew's perspective breaks the power of death. Now, we don't see that until Easter for Jesus, but Matthew seems to be saying that's even true for others at this point. What's also interesting is that they stay in their tombs until Easter. And what's also interesting as well is Matthew describes Jerusalem as the holy city as opposed to naming it Jerusalem. Why is all that significant? The most powerful form of impurity in the perspective of Jews in the first century was death. Because death separated you from God. There's no coming back from death. There's no way for a corpse to get itself in the right state to meet God unless there's a resurrection, right? And so some Jews at the time of Jesus believed there would be a life after death, some did not. So these dead bodies, these sources of impurity, these sources of defilement, at the death of Jesus, when it looks like Jesus himself has been defeated by death, these impure bodies who dwell in tombs come back to life. And then after Jesus is raised from the dead, they enter not the profane city, but the holy city, right? What's the opposite of defilement? Holiness. It seems that Matthew is saying something about the death of Jesus now opens the way for the power of death's defilement to be reversed or to be undone. And these people then go into the city. It would be nice if we knew more. These are the only 3 verses Matthew gives us about this. We don't have other documents that talk about people, meeting long lost relatives or things like that. But it's an interesting detail that Matthew puts in here to suggest that even at the moment of Jesus' death, even before we get to Easter, that something has happened, that somehow natural processes have been reversed or are being upended in some way. Let me just summarize this briefly then by these 6 points. And again, a lot of this presumes you were here last week. Apologies to those of you who weren't. Hopefully this is making sense. If not, we can talk about it. I would say this, that Matthew, I think, intensifies the tragedy that we saw in Mark's gospel. Because it follows Mark in so many ways, but then also we have various people whose treachery or whose failure that loom even larger. And so I would argue that Matthew emphasizes or gives us a greater sense of cynicism. I think Pilate and the chief priests, the actual people with the power to decide Jesus' life or death, are relatively uninterested in pursuing truth. There's a sense of their rash speech, right? The high priest says, I put you under oath, before God to tell us if you're the Messiah. Even Pilate's own hand washing might be a sign or an instance of rash speech. Ignorance, people who don't seem to know what they're doing, right? The people who should know better, the chief priests can't recognize Jesus in front of them. Missed opportunities, whether it's with Judas, whether it's with Pilate's wife's dream, opportunities that people had to recognize that maybe they're making a mistake or maybe they're doing the wrong thing. And then also maybe with that sign of the earthquake and these corpses being brought back to life, maybe some hope in Matthew's gospel, some pre-Easter hope, so to speak, that's a little bit harder to find in Mark, but Matthew, I think, includes that for us as well. That was a lot I fit in there in an hour. Sorry for talking so quickly if that was too fast, but I wanted to put, again, a lot of this out in front of us, kind of dump the box labeled Matthew on the table and see some of the pieces, that come out and get a sense for what's going on here. Maybe I should just start with other questions. Are there things that I should have said better or comments, corrections that you want to raise? I see Brent waving at me.
Matt, a quick question. A few years ago, I heard Pilate referred to as a builder. Like there are many sort of civic works, and you mentioned the aqueduct and other things like that. Is that a common narrative about him? Because I think that's important.
Mostly King Herod was the builder. King Herod,
okay.
The one who dies when Jesus is just probably a couple of years old, is really known as the builder. I mean, Herod essentially brings that region into the modern world of their time and gets a ton of money from Rome to do that, raises a ton of money and kind of puts the area on the map as a commercial crossroads. So Pilate in some ways carries on that tradition a little bit, but he's not as well known as like King Herod was.
And the reason I thought that was important, and funny because I was wrong, you're right. That's why you're the professor. I was because I think there are a lot of people who would have been around him who were part of this system.
Oh yeah.
Who were invested in this system, who were Jews, who things were going well for them at the expense of a lot of other members of society. So the idea that we would be, as members of Westminster and members of, middle-class society, that we would be, well, of course, we want to think of ourselves, we'd be with the disciples. But in reality, we'd be probably more likely to be members of the inner court and rooting for the status quo.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if we poke around the politics of the day, I think that's really true. I mean, Pilate has essentially one job. It's to protect Roman interests. And that means somebody who goes around claiming to be a king or announcing a new kingdom is probably not going to last very long, especially if that person is low class, low status, like Jesus appears to be. But Pilate can't do that in a way that's going to create a popular uprising, because that's also bad for business. And Pilate can't do that in a way that's going to antagonize the Jewish leadership, because they can complain to Rome if they want to. And the Roman leaders are in a similar, I mean, they have common cause with Pilate, right? It's best for all of us that this guy just go away, because we have too much to lose. The leadership's probably worried about losing their own personal power, but they're also worried about maybe the temple. They're worried about, it's only 200 years prior, less than 200 years prior, when the Syrians ruled over the land and sacrifice was forbidden, circumcision was forbidden. I mean, these people have memory from their relatively recent past of times when foreign non-Jewish powers essentially shut down Jewish religion. And so, Pilate on a bad day still isn't going to do that. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm just saying amen to what you said, Brent, that there's a lot going on here besides just we don't like Jesus.
Matt?
Yeah,
Matt,
Manley, hi.
Back in the early 60s, when I was a grad student at the University of Minnesota, there was a traveling evangelist who came around every spring and in front of Kaufman Union would spout his business and so forth. And there was another professor who was, if not an atheist, at least was an agnostic. And this was just probably about Good Friday time kind of thing. And brother, whatever his name was insisting there was a historic record of a major earthquake in Jerusalem at that time. Have you seen anything that would either verify or dispute that? Is there anything in the record that would indicate that there was an earthquake at the time that would have caused the destruction that Matthew mentions?
I don't know off the top of my head. I know where I could look it up. I know somebody who's probably written about it if there was. My initial response was there's a good major earthquake in that area about once every century. So by good, you know what I mean? By good, I mean serious, not good. But so I'd be a little skeptical of that, but I can look it up.
I have a question.
Yeah, Caroline.
So I'm really intrigued by, I wrote down the dream report by the woman who was married to Pilate. I turned that whole sentence around. And I'm curious about that and then Pilate washing his hands. And has there ever been any correlation between, maybe he did give a listen to the message that was delivered by his wife?
It's possible. It's possible. And again, let me be fair here that Pilate is read all sorts of different ways. Some people see him as a guy who recognizes that Jesus doesn't deserve this and Pilate really doesn't want it to happen, but Pilate feels overwhelmed and pressured by the crowd. That Pilate is the Shakespearean tragic figure and that he just can't make it happen. He just can't get Jesus free like he wants him to. And so he finally just gives up and says, I'm innocent of all of this. That would have been, it's possible that Matthew portrays him that way. It's possible that Matthew portrays him that way because Matthew is trying to downplay Jesus as a threat to Roman interests, right? That Matthew is writing Matthew's probably writing around the year 85, 90, something like that, a good 50 years plus after Jesus. And that Matthew is trying to tell the church, the Romans never had any problem with Jesus. The problem was the Jews had problems with Jesus. And so that Matthew's trying to kind of heighten Jewish guilt for the sake of helping the church navigate life in the Roman Empire. That's possible. I think that from what we know about Pilate from other sources, that he was just a harsh ruler in a lot of ways. And he had a habit of antagonizing the local Jewish leadership. It's hard for me to imagine that Pilate would wash his hands of anything. You know what I mean? It would be like reading a story about, oh, I don't know. I mean, it'd be like reading a story about Idi Amin, if I'm not dating myself too much, showing mercy to somebody where you would think, that's not the usual narrative we get about Idi Amin, that something smells fishy about this. And so I wonder if Matthew's writing to an audience that knows that Pilate will do all he can to carry out his official duties, but also stick it to the local Jewish leadership whenever he can, that might have been heard that way too. What's the right answer? It kind of depends what you see in the narrative. I think that's pretty ambiguous, but I kind of lean more toward the Pilate is trying to have multiple victories on this day. Pilate's trying to get rid of Jesus. He's also trying to kind of humiliate the priesthood in front of the people as well, and just remind everybody that Jews who show up with a royal agenda are going to get their just desserts. But you could be right, and it's possible that maybe, again, the woman who was Pilate's wife was perhaps a pivot in this story. That's another way of reading it, for sure. I have some questions. Okay, one more from Ken, and then we'll move to questions.
Could you speak a little bit about the use of the term "the saints"?
Sure.
In what context? Is it in the context of like what we consider as Presbyterian, for all the saints, or is it something different in that period?
That's a good question. In general, in the New Testament, it's used to refer to Christians, believers, people of faith. In Matthew, the question, though, is how would that be? If this is during Jesus' lifetime, who would these people have been? And so it probably has a sense, in Matthew, it probably has a sense of kind of revered Jewish leaders or something like that, or people who had really good reputations for holiness in their lifetime or something like that. Do you know what I mean? They might not necessarily have been people who even knew Jesus, but might have just been.
So it wasn't everyone.
It doesn't appear to, it doesn't appear that Matthew's saying that everybody rose from the dead that day or something like that. Which would be even more outlandish to verify, or more,
I was thinking of it more in terms of, was he designating that there were some that were worthy of being raised from the dead versus others that were not, by using the term saints?
That's possible. I mean, it's. I guess if one's going to come back to life, they all better, or you're going to start making distinctions, right?
Matt,
sorry, little resurrection humor there.
Matt, this is Ken Joslin. You can't see me because it's dark here, but I have a question that I suspect other people wonder about, and that is the term Son of God and Son of Man.
Yeah.
In 63, verse 63, the priest says, "Are you the Son of God?" And then in 64, Jesus says, "You have said so." And then he goes on to say, "The Son of Man will be seated next to the power," whatever. But if, obviously I don't know my Hebrew or Latin, but I'm assuming those are two different words. Son of God, Son of Man.
Yeah, they are. The short answer is that this is a huge question. Right, there's whole books written about the Son of Man title. So no answer I give you can really do justice to this. They are different titles. In general, Son of Man is a title that Jesus uses to speak about himself in the Gospels, while Son of God is usually a title that other people use to speak about him. It's not necessarily that they're saying, "Are you divine?" and he's saying, "No, I'm human." It's just kind of a way in which the Gospels reflect a pattern in how Jesus spoke about himself. The line he quotes there is from Daniel chapter 7. I think it's verse 13, if I remember correctly. Daniel 7:13, which is, it's part of the first half of the book of Daniel, are the stories we tell Sunday school kids about things like Daniel in the lion's den. The second half of Daniel are all the wild visions and fever dreams that Daniel has, dreaming about, monsters and symbols and imagery and things like that. And what he sees in Daniel 7 is one like a son of man, and that's the literal translate, or literally son of a human being. And what he's saying is, I saw somebody in the midst of this vision of all these monsters. I saw somebody who looked like a human being who went before the throne of God and was given authority. And so Jesus is quoting that here as in what seems to be a way in which he's saying, I'm like that guy in Daniel. I'm like that guy that Daniel talked about. I'm the one who's going to receive authority from God. So it is there's a lot of stuff going on there, because the word Messiah is used there, Son of God is used there in 63, and then Jesus refers to himself in 64 as Son of Man, which is kind of his preferred title. Christian tradition has kind of blended all of those together as just synonyms for Jesus, but they do all get used slightly differently in the Gospels. I have to leave it at that. I could one day when this is over, we'll go out for a drink after church, and I'll bore you for a good 90 minutes about the Son of Man problem.
Thank you.
And I'll even pay. So
that's going to be a crowded bar.
Yeah, not because of me, I hope, but yeah.
Matt?
Right. Yes.
Just one quick question, comment. Two of the powers that be, those that had all the powers, two groups, were deathly afraid of this man, of Jesus. So he must have had some tremendous power that they would want to go out on a limb and put him to death. And neither one wanted to take responsibility, but they both wanted the other one to do it. Is that possible?
I think so. I think that's a good point, that they both certainly, they're either afraid of him or they're afraid of his popularity, because they know that can be a problem, right? If the leaders violate the will of the people, there can be trouble. And the Jewish leadership knows there's no way to get Jesus killed unless the Roman governor okays it or endorses it. Pilate doesn't have a lot of reason to care about one more guy from Galilee. Pilate probably orders people to be crucified often. So, I mean, that's part of it too. But Pilate also knows he can't. If Pilate knows that this guy is a popular leader, Pilate has to be really careful about how are we going to kill him? When are we going to kill him? Who's going to be responsible for that, right? Because they have to take into account the crowd and the crowd's power and all of this too. But it's like I said last week, the fact that they want to kill him by crucifixion suggests they're going to play every card they can play to not just kill him, but discredit him and his movement and try to humiliate him. Right. I mean, that's where the stakes are really well, they're life and death stakes anyway, but that's where it's kind of breathtakingly high, that they see that as the way to do this, the way to get rid of their problem, so to speak. Which, you know, we talk about it so much in the church, maybe we're numb to that, but that still is, I think, dramatic in the sense of what do you have to, what are you trying to protect that you go to that kind of length in doing away with a rival or a threat? And as we talked about last week and brought up again tonight, I kind of with Brent's question or his comment, that in some ways we do this all the time. We all have institutions to protect, we all have power to protect, we all have criticism we want to avoid. We're probably too sophisticated, quote unquote, to crucify somebody today. But we have other ways of silencing those among us whose voices we tire of and things like that.